Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In this all-new weekly podcast episode of Stories from Maine, we will take a look at a man whose inventions, ingenuity, and inspiration led to many first-time events in American history. From medicinal aids to fire safety, air transportation, amusement rides, and even weapons of war, this man's engineering and clever inventing altered the world forever. And this incredible man was from Sangerville, Maine. Stay with us and hear the true story of Hiram Stevens Maxim, next on Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine podcast episode for the second week of February, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. The all-new book, Stories from Maine 3, Mayhem, Murder, and Execution in the Pine Tree State, will publish in May of 2025. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we go back to February 5th of 1903, when Joan Whitney is born at Manhasset, in New York. By 1924, at the age of 21, Joan marries Charles Shipman Payson, a Portland, Maine attorney, and she establishes residency in Falmouth, Maine. By 1962, Joan Whitney Payson becomes the first woman in American history to own a Major League Baseball franchise when she founds the New York Mets baseball team. Under her ownership, Shea Stadium is built in Flushing, New York, where the New York Mets would go on to earn their nickname, the Miracle Mets, and win their first World Series in 1969. Over her lifetime, Joan had accumulated a large collection of art, which she then donates a large portion of to the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine. A collection which is still frequently displayed. When she dies in 1975, she is buried at the Pine Grove Cemetery in Falmouth, Maine. Her husband then assumed ownership of the New York Mets, thereby making the New York Mets a truly Maine-made baseball team, and one of our beloved Stories from Maine. Now, let's go over to Oscar for this week's feature story.
From the first portable asthmatic inhaler, to the first automatic fire sprinkler system, to the first fully automatic machine gun, and the first airplane to actually fly, one man's inventions changed the world. And that man was born and raised in Maine. Hiram Stevens Maxim was born on February 5th of 1840 in Sangerville, just on the outskirts of Guilford, Maine. He was born to Isaac and Harriet Stevens Maxim, and raised and educated there in Sangerville. Hiram grew up working on the family farm, and during his free time, he kept busy tinkering with ideas and designs that existed within his mind. By the age of 14, Hiram began working for a local carriage maker named Daniel Sweat. There he learned the blacksmith trade. After 2 years of his apprenticeship, Hiram went to Montreal in Canada and worked for a time for Daniel Flint in a similar trade. Hiram also began reading books on engineering, manufacturing, and mathematical principles. In short, he read everything of use to his interests which he could get his hands upon. While the American Civil War was underway, Hiram returned to the United States and soon arrived in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. There, Hiram would live and work with his mother's brother, Hiram's uncle, Levi Stevens. Hiram served an apprenticeship under his uncle Levi, who owned an engineering firm, where Hiram learned the engineering trade. Hiram soon worked his way up to the position of draftsman. Unfortunately, Hiram and his uncle Levi eventually had a falling out, a disagreement that saw Hiram leave his uncle's employment after just a few years. Hiram then went to work for the Oliver Drake Gas Machine Works. There, Hiram was able to learn more of the engineering principles he would need to complete his own plans for the inventions he was dreaming of. By 1866, Hiram applied for the first of his many patents. His improved hair curling iron was a simple invention, and one that would set him on a long path of success and wealth. He then invented and patented a new type of brighter headlight for train locomotives. While still in Boston, there had been numerous factory and warehouse fires, and the loss of investments was unimaginably high. Hiram was soon asked if he could figure out a way to abate the problem. What Maxim eventually designed became the world's first automatic fire sprinkler system. In this device, during a fire, a glass gauge would melt under the heat from the blaze and would then initiate a flood of water over the area of fire, and the low water flow would trip an alarm, alerting the local fire department. Unfortunately, Hiram's system was seen as too expensive and too difficult a system to manufacture and to install at the time. Yet, Hiram's design became the basic blueprint for the modern-day fire sprinkler suppression system and fire notification device in use throughout the world today. Within 6 years, Hiram would then move to New York City to bigger and better things. By 1873, Hiram had partnered up with an investor named J. Welch, and together they opened a company they named Maxim and Welch Gas and Steam Engineers of New York. From this position, Maxim had assumed a post as the chief engineer to the United States Electric Lighting Company. Maxim then designed a way to apply carbon to the incandescent filaments within light bulbs. Hiram patented the process and began to manufacture and sell his own light bulbs, just as New York City was being electrified. Yet, an epic legal battle over the light bulb between Maxim and famed inventor Thomas Edison would see Maxim's patent nullified, and Maxim's process soon lost all legal protections and was eventually copied worldwide. Maxim had been dealt a terrible blow and a serious financial setback, but he soon rallied. Soon after the lawsuit was over, the United States Electric Lighting Company sent Hiram to England to work on electrifying London. While there, Maxim began work on a new invention, one that would also change the world and the nature of warfare. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this weekly podcast episode. Please help us by taking a moment to subscribe or follow Stories from Maine and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us to reach more listeners and make our weekly podcast a success. And please join us every Saturday for a new episode of Stories from Maine. Meanwhile, follow us on Facebook, where we post new images, articles, and Maine-related content each day. Just go to www.facebook.com/Stories from Maine. Now, let's go back to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this next segment of This Week in Maine History, we will jump ahead to February 9th of 2019, when Reverend Thomas James Brown, a 49-year-old, Michigan-born minister, is promoted to serve as the 10th bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Maine. Brown's appointment makes him the first openly gay and married bishop to ever serve in the state of Maine, and the third such bishop to be appointed in the history of the United States. Now, let's get back to Oscar and our feature story.
By 1883, Hiram Maxim was living in Hatton Garden, near London, and he had engaged with a new partner, Albert Vickers, and they had set up a new factory they called the Maxim Gun Company. And their principal product was a new type of rapid-fire machine gun, Hiram called the Maxim gas-powered machine gun. Maxim's invention was the first fully automatic loading, recoil-operated, rapid-fire machine gun in world history. The first prototype of the weapon could fire more than 600 rounds per minute, and the weapon could be rotated a full 360 degrees. The Maxim machine gun was portable easy to maintain, easy to operate, and easy to repair. In short, it was the most perfectly made weapon ever produced for modern combat, which had ever been designed, built, and tested in military history. And by July of 1883, Maxim's British patents were filed, and the Maxim gun was soon in full production. By 1890, Hiram Maxim had more ideas, which he was furthering to work on. Maxim had been tinkering with the idea of a flying machine, one that would allow man to take to the air like a bird in flight. There were many who were already attempting this feat, but Hiram had a design of his own that he was sure would fly. Not only did he have a design for a plane, he also had a design for an engine to power that plane. By mid-year, Maxim's huge design had been built into a working bi-wing model, complete with a 100-foot wingspan and 2 steam-powered engines, with each engine generating over 180 horsepower, spinning each of the plane's 2 propellers. The plane sat upon a deck that was guided along on a set of rails, much like a train, to help the heavy machine take flight. The monstrosity weighed a total of over 7,000 pounds. But immediately, the plane ran into trouble, as it had certain problems allowing it to get off the ground. So, Maxim teamed up with a French plane designer named Clement Ader. Together, the two altered Maxim's plane and readjusted the designs. Maxim had thus far invested a total of 20,000 pounds into this project, and his new plane was once again ready for further testing. Maxim also had a plan to recoup his investments in his flying machine by employing a new type of amusement ride, one that was part mechanical feat and part promotional genius. Maxim called the Endeavor the captive flying machine. This amusement ride lifted people off the ground and allowed them to feel the limited experience of flight. The machine was so popular that it became one of Maxim's most profitable ventures ever. On Maxim's actual aeroplane, the two men soon doubled the amount of horsepower each engine could generate, and they strengthened the frame of the plane, all while lightening the new design. Then the two men lengthened the rail of the guiding track and gave the plane a higher point from which to begin. But the machine now weighed almost 1,000 pounds more than the original aircraft, and the wingspan had been increased from 100 feet to 104 feet in width, and the plane was now more than 120 feet in overall length. Maxim's flying machine was nothing shy of a behemoth monstrosity. Yet, Maxim and Ader had made 2 test runs, and they had made numerous adjustments to their flying machine. Then, on Tuesday, July 31st of 1894, Hiram Maxim climbed aboard his flying machine and sat down behind the controls. The engines were started, pressure was built up, and Maxim engaged the propellers. Maxim throttled up and released the brake, and the huge monster Endeavor began lumbering down the track. It quickly picked up speed, and suddenly, while the behemoth creaked and clattered, it slowly lifted from the moving platform and became airborne. For a distance of more than 100 feet, Maxim's flying machine flew just a modest 2 feet above the ground, with Hiram Maxim at the controls. Then, just as suddenly as the plane had lifted off, it also came down and slammed into the ground. Maxim's plane had become the first airplane to actually fly in powered flight, but it was also the first to crash after flight. Although Maxim had only suffered minor injuries, the plane was seriously damaged. Had Maxim's plane landed safely, his place in aviation history would have been secured, and no one would have ever heard of Orville and Wilbur Wright. We'll be right back.
If you are enjoying our Stories from Maine podcast, then you might also enjoy our Stories from Maine books. Stories from Maine, True Tales from America's 23rd State, and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, can be purchased through all retail bookstores and through Amazon. And Laurie Suzanne Dell's Stories from Maine 3, Mayhem, Murder and Execution, in the Pine Tree State, will publish in May of 2025. You can also enjoy our weekly feature articles in the weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record. These articles are available on newsstands or online at the Times Record Facebook page or on our Stories from Maine page on Facebook.
In this next segment of This Week in Maine History, we visit February 12 of 1959, when builders from New York donate a 31-foot-tall statue of fictional literary legend Paul Bunyan to the city of Bangor, Maine, in celebration of Bangor's 125th anniversary. Although the fictional Paul Bunyan's birthplace is disputed, his birthday is recorded as February 12 of 1834, and interestingly, the Bangor City Clerk's office has Paul Bunyan's birth certificate on display. The statue can still be visited at Bass Park on Bangor's Main Street. Now, let's get back to Oscar for the conclusion of our story.
Although Maxim would lose interest in his flying machine after this semi-successful test flight, he did earn a place in the Guinness Book of Air Facts and Feats for 1894. And Maxim's plane was repaired and set up as a popular and functioning ride attraction at a London exhibit, where people were given rides for just 5 shillings. By 1895, Maxim's devastating weapon, the Maxim machine gun, had been placed in use in the British military efforts of the First Matabele War. Soon after, nations were lining up to buy as many of the Maxim guns as were available to them. And Maxim was even designing larger versions for installation on the decks of naval ships. By 1899, Hiram Maxim had enjoyed his life in Great Britain, where he was treated as a hero. On September 16th of that year, while still maintaining an American citizenship, Hiram Maxim also became a naturalized citizen of Great Britain. By 1900, Queen Victoria had knighted Maxim, who then became known as Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim. On November 24th of 1914, Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim died in his Streatham home in London. He was just 76 years old. He was interred in the West Norwood Cemetery in South London. Over his lifetime, Hiram Maxim created numerous inventions. Maxim had also invented a device to prevent ships from rolling in rough seas, and he created a demagnetizer for watches, a riveting machine, and a coffee substitute. It is evident today that while Hiram Maxim was a genius at inventing, he seems not to have had much success in marketing or promotions. However, Maxim's promotional brilliance with the amusement ride, Maxim's captive flying machine, had proven so popular and so profitable that by 1904 Maxim had moved the amusement park ride to Blackpool, England, at the Pleasure Beach Amusement Park, where the popular ride is still running today. And now, the creative inventions and incredible life of Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim lives on today in the many legendary and iconic of our Stories from Maine.
We hope that you have enjoyed this weekly podcast episode of Stories from Maine. Join us again next Saturday as we bring you another true and great tale from America's 23rd state of Maine. See you then.
You can find Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. All original content contained in this podcast is copyright 2025, all rights reserved. Thank you for listening.